For over half a century, humans have endeavored to make business a force for good. But is the movement working? Or is it time to explore a new path forward? Welcome to Less Talk, More Action. We are your hosts, Joel Caesar and Owen Barrett, experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. In each episode, we ask provocative questions and share stories from the front lines of sustainability with leaders in science, tech, and business taking real action to design a cleaner, better future. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to Less Talk, More Action podcast. My name is Joel Caesar, the world's undisputed voice of building decarbonization. Joining me today is a special co-host appearance by Sherrell Dorsey, the Force of Nature award-winning climate tech and business journalist, author, and entrepreneur. She's been on the show previously. She interviewed me when I did a keynote at the Net Zero conference. So she stepped in for Owen today, who's out there selling solar, installing solar. As we talk about in this episode, it's actually really interesting because Owen's so busy right now because there's a lot of his clients that have urgency to install solar because of the federal tax credit about to expire. But yeah, I was fortunate enough to be joined by Sherrell, who's really a fascinating voice in this space and brings a lot of dynamic perspectives because she's talking to founders and she's running TED Talks. And yeah, just really an honor to have her on the show. So with that, no Owen, we're going to dive right into an amazing conversation with Sherrell Dorsey. Joining us today is Sherrell Dorsey, an award-winning climate tech and business journalist, author, and entrepreneur. She is the founder of The Plug, the pioneering news and insights platform covering the Black innovation economy, which went on to be acquired after reshaping how we think about equity and innovation in tech. Sherrell is also the author of Upper Hand, the Future of Work for the Rest of Us, and has been featured in outlets like Fast Company Inc. and The Atlantic. Recognized nationally for her leadership at the intersection of sustainability, technology, and equity, Sherrell brings a powerful voice to the conversation on how we build a more inclusive and climate-resilient future. So, Sherrell, welcome to Less Talk, More Action.
Yes, thank you. I feel like a veteran now. Thank you for having me back. I feel like our last deep dive was around Climate Week and right before the Net Zero conference, where I had the privilege of getting a chance to interview you and listen to all of your big ideas, and I think some gripes too about this space.
Yeah, well, I was honored to be interviewed by you. And like you said, you've been on the pod, I think one of our first recurring guests here. And we're going to have a little fun today. This is a atypical show. My usual co-host, Owen, is not available. He's out. Interestingly enough, you might be aware, and I think a lot of our audience would be, the federal investment tax credit for solar is expiring in July, and Owen is a solar entrepreneur, and what that's done to his business is stimulate a lot of action in the short term because there's urgency to that market, which is interesting. Like, we can get into what that means for the future maybe of energy policy. But yeah, so he's busy out there and couldn't do the podcast, and I thought, well, let's do something different. Let's bring back Sherrell, and we're going to do kind of a hybrid. We'll interview each other and just talk about the world as we see it, and we'll jump off from there. So usually we start with, I'd ask you, how are you taking action to make the world a better place? So why don't you go from there? You can start with that as the prompt.
Yeah, I always love that. It's, first of all, such an existential question, and having come off of San Francisco Climate Week, which I think we're actually going to get into, and then sort of having reshaped my work over the last year, I've really been faced with this existential question of, like, what do I need to be doing right now? I've been as a journalist, as a storyteller, and really trying to amplify big ideas that have the potential to win. I always felt like my role in helping to change the world or shape the world or do something or make the world a better place is ensuring that this ecosystem sees change makers, and change makers get connected to audiences and get connected to capital. And so I've always felt like that has been my responsibility. But now I'm in this space, Joel, where I'm thinking so much more deeply about community at large, family, my greater community, as I'm kind of transitioning back into New York and kind of looking for that more permanent neighborhood. and what role my job now is to be a really good community member, and ensuring that I'm being a steward of resources and of information. That was a very long-winded response, but just walk with me here. But yeah, I think about, so many of our neighbors, and folks just on the everyday who aren't in these spaces with us, where I think we have a responsibility to just show up as best as we can within our neighborhoods or zip codes, with support or resources, or even just something optimistic about what's possible.
It's really great. I appreciate sort of the vulnerability in that answer, and I would say I'm similarly like having a lot of moments with what does impact mean to me, and I thought it was really clear for a long time. And the older I get, the longer I'm doing the work, I start to question like, is what I've been focusing on really having an impact? Is it the way I should spend my life and my time? And I still believe in my heart, like I want to do things that are better for the world, better for the planet, better for people. It's why I got into the work I'm doing, and you might call environmental sustainability. But it reminds me, I actually just read a post this morning, and I'm sorry, we're jumping all over the place already. Do you know the guy? You know Blake Mycoskie? He's the CEO and founder of Tom's Shoes. You know the story
Oh,
of Tom?
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, yeah.
He wrote one of his books is like my favorite business book. It's called "Start Something That Matters," and it really inspired me to be a mission-driven entrepreneur at one point. And I've had a couple failed endeavors at that, but at least I was motivated, I think, by
Yeah.
the right initiatives. But he wrote a long post this morning. I don't know when he wrote it, but I read it this morning about how he's had all this success. He built Tom's, one of the coolest companies ever, had financial success, sold it to, I think, BlackRock. And then all the impact he was provided in developing countries, providing shoes. And so he's like, had it all. At 43 years old, he was writing, like, he sold his company, had all the financial success he could ask for, had this great story of impact and the people he's helped along the way. But then I guess he fell into depression shortly thereafter and has struggled in his 40s. And now, I think he's 49, and he wrote about how like his next endeavor is to try to help people like himself who are struggling with where they are in the world and how they move forward. And once you reach the mountaintop as an entrepreneur or whatever endeavor you're doing in your professional career, then what? So I really resonate with me because I think as you and I are both acknowledging here, we're like, what should we focus on and what matters?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so many challenges, right? And then I think probably as people as well who try to stay informed, who try to work on our own professional development, try to ensure that like our thinking continues to evolve about what's possible. It can be such a tremendous task, so I can see that being overwhelming. I sold my media company. I wasn't as, successful as the CEO of Tom's in that, but I do remember, taking some time, almost 2 years off kind of, to really think about, what is next, what's meaningful. And I knew I wanted to hyper focus on the climate space for sure, because I just felt like none of these great, big, bold ideas are going to get off the ground if we don't have a livable planet, right? But I also understand the challenge of, not wanting to just jump into anything, right? I think sometimes, especially when you've had some great success, and be it as an entrepreneur, and sometimes I think even when you are coming out of a corporate space or maybe like a nonprofit space, right? And been doing something for such a significant period of time, something that gave you such strong conviction, and probably was very rewarding. And you get to that place where you're like, okay, I'm letting go of these reins, but now what reins do I grab onto? That can be really, really tough. And a lot of times you have so many options, right? Because people see how successful you've been. Obviously, you can kind of jump into almost anything and like take it to the top. But if you are someone who really, really wants to lead with conviction, not just anything will do. Obviously, he could go and start his own VC firm, right? And start investing in other companies and do that whole circuit across the ecosystem, which maybe he'll do a little bit of that. Who's the CEO, the former CEO of Skillshare? It took him a few years, and I think it's like Encore, I forget his last name. But then he started Carry Wealth, which kind of started creating a platform of financial systems like solo 401ks, tax services, financial planning for founders and kind of high net worth individuals who were building these companies but didn't have any support around like tax strategy, saving for their retirements or what have you. Like that company just got acquired last week. So I'm like, okay, what is he going to do now again, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's just this never ending cycle, which is, I mean, good problems, right? But, also that like sense of responsibility,
Yeah,
now what do I do?
and it sounds like for you too, and similar to what Blake Mycoskie said, like identity. Even as you described, either you're coming from corporate or nonprofit, whether you spend a lot of time in a place, and that's definitely me. I mean, like I, not as successful as you, I didn't have an exit like that, but you build something that becomes your identity, and then if you start to think whether or not you have a successful exit, or maybe you decide I need to try something different, but like that's a hard moment. So that's cool. We started with vulnerability and personal stories and success and next steps. Let's transition into what people listen to the podcast for usually, which is
Yeah.
something around the intersection of climate, sustainability, business, tech, something things I know you're an expert in and I like to talk about. And I think you mentioned it as in your first answer. We're going to talk about San Francisco Climate Week. So let's kick off there. I didn't know you were there. Were you were in San Francisco?
Yeah, so I just went for a very specific event, Planet House, which was activated at the Battery. I actually got a chance to attend some activations back in New York Climate Week last year, and so they are continuing this model, particularly around building space and conversation of like commercial goods, right? So everything from like packaging design to that like circular economy around fashion, beauty, all of these things. And this is spearheaded by Julia Collins, whom you may know or at least be familiar with. She's created a couple of different companies that have been very successful. There was Zoom, which was a robot pizza company, which was really cool. And then she created. She now runs Planet Forward, which provides some AI analytics, ingredient sourcing from like regenerative spaces for the larger kind of food supply industry. But she also spearheaded the development of Moonshot Snacks, which was acquired by Patagonia a few years ago. And the snacks are amazing. I picked them up like Whole Foods, wherever. So anyway, her whole thing is like, not only has she been successful and been a leader in kind of this idea around regenerative ingredients, farming, agricultural practices that are much more friendly to the earth, but then also how do we now think through the entire, supply chain of production to distribution, right, to consumption, and then that kind of going back into the cycle. So Planet House was amazing. There were, I want to say, hundreds of brands. I got a chance to interview several founders and CEOs across categories, building some incredible things and kind of having very specific convictions around their impact on the planet. There was like Sway, which builds a seaweed-based like plastic that's like fully biodegradable, which was really cool. And the material itself, extremely durable, very, very well done. You had companies like Seed, the symbiotic probiotic company kind of came out. And so there was just so much going on, but it really gave people an opportunity to hear from, learn from circular economy experts across the board, and then also kind of have some fun. So lots of like sampling, lots of cool foods and beverages and perfumes or what have you. And one of the things that like Julia's philosophy is around, we have to make, the sustainability conversation enjoyable and desirable.
Oh
right?
man,
And
couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and so lots of fun. So that was the only thing I did for San Francisco Climate Week because I had a closeout to Earth Week on Friday. So I went in 24 hours, interviewed a bunch of CEOs there, and then flew back out for my event on Friday. So it's been insane. But you'll have to tell me how like you experienced the week. I didn't know you were there either. I probably should have guessed that.
Well, my trip was kind of impromptu and actually was not intended to be at Climate Week. Some people know some of my content recently has been pretty critical of Climate Weeks in general, as like a lot of grandstanding and not a lot of action, which this podcast likes to be critical of. So even someone was like, "What are you doing in Climate Week? I thought you're a hater." And so I was there for a couple client meetings, some very cool Cambio client meetings for some of our existing clients in the Bay Area. And
Nice.
then I was like, all right, I'm here. Let's go to the Climate Week events.
Yeah.
And kind of crashed a couple events. And mainly I was enjoying some of the happy hours and things. And, you know, as always, great, cool people with all the best intentions. But I think when you interviewed me at the Net Zero conference, I had recently, I think it was after New York Climate Week, and I had a LinkedIn post New York Climate Week, where I said the climate movement is delusional and out of touch. Like that was my reflection of the New York Climate Week
Yeah,
last year.
I read it. I literally
Yeah.
read the post on stage and was like, so here is your brain. Let's start here.
Yeah, yeah. And so I guess I would say a lot of the climate weeks are delusional and out of touch, but San Francisco, I mean, I'll just a couple anecdotes that drove me nuts, and you know, maybe you can kind of level set me. This will be a good for because
Yeah.
you're trying to be more optimistic than me these days. But like this will come back to the enjoyable part. But I have had. I don't want to get too wonky in my world, but I'm in the world of buildings and real estate and construction, and that's been my space for a long time. And in that space, if you're working with large commercial real estate owners, like my current company wants to, like Owen's trying to when he's here, a lot of what is driving the conversation is something called building performance standards. So these are regulations that cities or states are enacting to tell existing buildings you're going to be capped, either your energy usage or your greenhouse gas emissions is going to have a cap, and it's going to phase in over time. And eventually, in a couple of cities, it's already happening, like New York and Denver.
Yeah.
If you're exceeding these caps of emissions, your building, you will start to be fined as an owner. And everyone in our space has been championing this legislation for years. And I used to work for the city of Santa Monica. I wrote one of these policies back then, and we were collaborating with LA. So I'm kind of, I would say, pretty knowledgeable on the topic. But what I've seen is like they're not going to work. It's kind of overregulated, and every time the economy gets tight or gets in a troublesome way, the large wealthy real estate owners are going to push to the city and say, you can't do this. This isn't going to work. It's going to lead to more unemployment. And so I just been vocal about, I think this is like, we're paying too much attention, putting too much emphasis on these regulations, and they're actually never going to work. And I don't even know if they're going to achieve the intended outcome. And so oftentimes people in my space who like used to think I was one of the champions like them are like, what's your problem? Like they attack me at a happy hour, like corner me. Like, why are you against BPS these days? And I was staying on Market Street in San Francisco, and I love San Francisco. I've lived there in the past. I think it's probably, sometimes when I've heard the news like San Francisco's falling apart, I've been like, it can't be that bad. I've been there. It's always had this kind of, you know, like, I don't know how you describe it, maybe like a freewheeling society, especially in parts of the city. But I mean, there's parts of that city, Market Street. I went to coffee at 7 a.m. I didn't feel safe. I mean, it's not cool what's happening in big parts of San Francisco, and I think a lot of our major cities. And I was just arguing with this guy who was attacking me. I was like, you think in these cities right now where vacancy's down in commercial office and housing is expensive and crime is up, we should be regulating buildings more because of climate? And you know, again, like this is putting me at odds with the industry that I'm serving, that I've tried to be a leader in, but it's kind of this, are we being delusional and out of touch as a climate movement? And I think in that example that I'm describing, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think it's yes too. I mean, and like unequivocally yes. And partly because I think you and I both get to be in very privileged spaces and environments, and a lot of feel good spaces where, sure, like we have this sense of knowing and access, right? And so we can make choices, I think, in a way that not everyone is thinking about, right? There's a trendiness to it.
Well said.
And
yeah.
I think that I struggle with understanding that America is built off the back of consumption, right? And consumerism. So it's the idea of, well, let's make things much more planet friendly to consume, which, yes, based on the society and the systems that we have, let's do this more gently. I mean, obviously, if we wanted to kind of end the impact on Mother Nature, we would just stop producing, right? We would just stop producing, and we would just continue to use until, you know, like I look at like these Reddit buy nothing groups, right? Or these like spaces where people are bartering in community, like sharing supplies instead of this like subscription rental economy that emerged, you know, out of Silicon Valley, that kind of ended up creating a dependency because people had to fill in gaps of income, right, as the cost of living increased. And then we had, of course, wage growth just not increasing, even if you're a top earner. San Francisco is not one of my favorite cities, primarily for the reasons that you just shared. I believe it is representative of an America that is very scary, and where the lack of protection for communities and societies have really failed. And I say that as someone who's from Seattle, who's really only lived in coastal big cities, high cost of living cities, and watching the suffering alongside extreme levels of wealth, right?
Yeah.
And like, and you know, and I'm not, you know, saying that those who have done extremely well to be apologetic, but I do think there is a tremendous disconnect when I'm in these spaces, and it's like living between multiple realities and like multi simulations happening at one time, right?
Man, it's you're you're getting deep. I wasn't expecting you to go here. It's I'm really agreeing, and it's you said, like, you know, I don't know if you said the word privilege, but I think you're kind of implying, like, you and I and lots of folks that get to think about climate as the topic of most importance in their lives. It's like, well, that's kind of out of touch. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
But
well, I mean, because our basic needs are met,
yeah,
right? And then some.
we have the privilege to think climate is the biggest threat in our lives. That's a
Yeah,
privilege.
yeah. And so as a communicator, and I was mentioning this kind of as we were getting started to record, you know, I was in a call last week with a series of really talented climate communicators that are on significant platforms, right? And as a journalist, you know, part of my work is about being a public service, right, to people around information, helping them to have the information they need to make decisions for themselves, for their families, for their lives, right, and
Truth,
to help kind of create this sense of guidance.
truth, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Like actual journalism,
Yeah,
well researched, you know, all of
yeah,
that. You know, while at the same time, you know, having to digest and really look at some people's lived realities, and then even like my own lived reality, my industry from journalism and media is changing drastically on a daily basis.
can't
It's
imagine.
shrinking in many ways, right? I've had to reinvent myself. I've had to build my own work, right? Because I graduated from university in 2010. So when I think of all of the inventions and reinventions and adapting to different economic realities, you know, I think about how exhausting that is. And so when we do think about what are the actual solutions, especially in a time where people are just trying to afford groceries, right? Like, what helps? What creates jobs when, you know, Oracle last week laid off 30,000 people, right? Who are probably going to be experiencing some level of economic insecurity for the first time. You're talking about people who've built up 10, 20, 30-year careers in one specific space, having gone to university and got all the right degrees, all the STEM degrees, right? And so, yeah, I think it might be irresponsible for us to kind of be just like, oh yeah, the climate movement needs all of these things. And I think sort of looking at it, almost ranking them in terms of importance is important. But there's also the part of me that's like, yeah, but we also have to change systems completely. And so I kind of want some of these manufacturers that are kind of finding new ways to craft a plastic-esque substance to prosper. I think that that's going to be a job growth opportunity or multiplier, and
Yeah.
perhaps some tertiary industries that emerge. And so I'm not an economist, you know, and I try to read what economists are saying about this AI movement, and this transition with how tech has accelerated. But I'm also looking at builders. And so one of the words or terms that kind of came up in my discussion last week with climate communicators was, you know, I'm optimistic. Apocalyptic. Yeah, it's like apocalyptic optimist, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, and like,
We're
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
make
yeah,
that. We're gonna
yeah.
make that the title of this episode.
Like, yeah, like, you know, it might suck really bad for a while, but there's also these shining moments that are worth paying attention to. And whether or not I have a bias towards like, oh, I think that's going to work, I'm like, let me see how that plays out. I may not be the biggest champion of that, but like, let me see how that plays out. And then personally, I want to get to like the real roots, right? I want to do things that make sense. And even like, obviously you work in real estate, buildings, things like that. I think about homes and energy efficiencies. I think about building materials. I think about wildfires. I think about natural disasters. And so I think about the opportunity of, I did a whole podcast episode for TED on self-healing concrete and all of these cities and countries that are using these like hybridic new structures of sustainable concrete, because concrete's like one of the biggest emitters of carbon,
Totally. Yeah.
of carbon, emissions in the world, right? And so, this innovation, this like material science innovation around this material that we use everywhere on everything, being something that can change in an instant and be adopted. Like, I think that's significant. So if we're changing the way we're building things, in our homes and our offices being tremendous emitters, like that's infrastructure I don't have to think about. Like, I'm just sorting recycling in my house and trying to make sure I take shorter showers and turn off power, right? But like, if the engineered infrastructure is fundamentally different across the industry, like that's probably going to do more than just my individual contributions. So I don't know. I'm talking in circles here, but I'm just like,
No, you're not. Let me actually. I was going
yeah.
to say. I'm gonna pull a thread through a couple things you said here into something I believe. Like you say your brand. What you're doing now is big ideas, and connecting change makers to audiences. I would say one of my big ideas that I continue to struggle with and be attacked by, but I think is real, which is like, I think the climate movement is kind of dead, and just no one wants to admit it yet. It doesn't mean impact is dead. It doesn't mean the environment has other things we should be doing. That's why I'm so interested in the Planet House thing you went through. Like, that wasn't about climate. That was more about like circular economy. And everyone's always going to bring stuff back to climate. Of course, there's climate benefits from waste reduction, but I'm like, what else could we be focused on? If all these people that went to climate weeks and went to Davos and we're asking cities to tax people on BPS and all this crap we throw at climate that's not working,
Yeah.
imagine if we directed all that energy towards like other parts of the environment that could help. And so like, and then this other part of,
But
I think
but pause really quick to go back to that. What other parts? Like, what other parts that you feel like could help that are not getting the attention that it deserves, or they're just like kind of general ideas of there's other areas to focus on that we should be
well,
centering our.
I think energy affordability is the thing
Yeah.
of the current, and I say this a lot about, let's say right now big tech hyperscalers. I worked for one of them. I know a little bit about how the inside talk conversations around net zero happen, but they especially, I won't speak for all of them, but there's a mindset internally at the big ones where like they use the term license to operate, meaning they recognize they are giant, not monopolies, but really like forces of nature within the global economy. And they do things for social responsibility because they need the public to be on their side. And maybe their founders and their executives believe they're doing what's right anyway. But like, if you're thinking in terms of just like transactional decision making they're doing, it's like, we have to have the public on our side. And so for a long time, for the last, I don't know, 10, at least 5 years, it's been climate, net zero. Got to have net zero commitment, got to be on it, got to be throwing resources at it. But I think that's already changing because the data center backlash is showing that communities care less about your net zero commitment than they do about making sure they can afford their energy bill. And so these license to operate motivations will start to go towards energy affordability. And I think that's great. I think cities should too. That's one of my issues with BPS. It's like, hey, city government, instead of taxing existing buildings because you don't like their carbon emissions, how about figuring out a way to help residents pay less for their energy usage? I mean, as a New York resident, I'm sure you're already seeing what it's like here in New York. So that's one area to answer your question. And the other is just nature. And I think this comes to another thread I wanted to pull of yours, which is Julia, Planet House, you said like enjoyable, desirable. I get in arguments all the time with people on LinkedIn about like, hey, get your Debbie Downer environmental crap off my feed. Like, no one follows that. That's not how we build coalitions. That has not worked. So even if you think the sky is falling, that messaging isn't going to work. So I'm going to like push it back to you and say,
Yeah.
you're an expert on communication. You're an expert on branding and messaging. You even talked about this a little bit with the way journalism's evolving. And I'm trying to think about my own brand and what we're doing with our podcast. And even this is going to pull another thread of like AI slop. Like, what's that doing to all of our messaging? So I guess all of that, we're talking in circles here a little bit myself, but like, I'm going to throw it back to you. What's your message to folks out there who are trying to portray a message in this new era of messaging and social media and AI?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been noisy, right? Like super, super noisy. Um, and the algorithm favors controversy. It favors rage.
Conflict. Yeah.
Conflict, us at each other's throats, and it doesn't really support dialogue or exchange of ideas in a non-harmful sort of way.
Mm.
And I I think I've kind of done this throughout my reporting career. And maybe it's kind of the safe answers that, I've hyper focused on people building things because I think it takes a lot of, chutzpah and moxie to say, I believe in this idea so strongly, I'm going to pursue it, and it might actually fail, but it also might be really successful. And I can change the world with this one thing potentially. And I think that's kind of safe, right? I think that provides a level of objectivity in just supporting an ecosystem of builders and creatives, which is kind of popular right now.
And builders and creatives have to be optimists themselves, so you're leaning into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I do get challenged in this environmental and sustainability space because, yes, politically, it's a cluster right now. I mean, it's always been it's always been a cluster. And then, of course, like there's the doom and gloom side of things. Like, the polar bears have less space to roam about. The droughts are coming in Arizona, and it's going to be even worse as these data centers get built out. And there's a lot of truth to all of this, Joel. And I try to find myself leveling out the conversation, and hyper focusing on what's the bigger question at play here. Why are we still building things for destruction? And so I guess in the realm of messaging right now, I think number one, it's owning our own voices because there is so much AI slop, because there's so many things and people who are telling us what to think and where to focus. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to do just even personally and through sort of my own sense of, building my voice in these very, very noisy environments, it's let me think about the bigger question here, because all this other stuff is like banter. And it's not that it's inaccurate banter. It just doesn't get us to potential solutions. It doesn't get us asking the actual right questions. And so if I was building a brand, I'd try to focus on where has the conversation missed? And then what kind of solutions might we put on the table or might exist that are doing something really fascinating? And what I find with builders, like true builders, they're not as tuned into these conversations. They're just building really dope things. Yeah. They're not waiting to be recognized for their solutions. And so zeroing in on the actual things that are working, even if it's not at this massive scale just yet, I think that allows me to look at some optimistic parallels and say, yeah, it sucks, but it doesn't suck that bad because this exists. And again, Apocalyptic.
I like it. I had a fairly controversial LinkedIn post last week, which I leaned into the conflict to get some clicks here, to be to be transparent. But I did some research. I was like, everyone on Earth Week is always posting the sky's falling. Here's the worst thing, the hottest year ever. Climate's gonna kill us all. And I'm like you said, of course we can't dismiss that. But there's a lot of good things happening too. So I just did some research on like, give me some data points on what's good happening out there. And actually, polar bears, you brought up, polar bears populations have increased from 5,000 in the 60s to like 26,000 today. Humpback whales are recovering. There's all this good stuff happening with salmon in the Pacific Northwest as we remove dams.
Yeah.
There's coral reefs actually can recover faster than we initially believed. There's people throwing regenerative farming in the U.S. has increased by 3x. So like, there's things, and this goes back to like what you said, what should we be focusing on? Though, look what I just said: nature, biodiversity, food security, regenerative agriculture, all these things you could be focusing on if you weren't so laser focused on climate. But I'll just like reflect on what you said just as the messaging too. It's a hunch I have, and you're more of an expert than I, that as AI slop becomes more and more prevalent, people want to see and hear directly from human beings, like podcasts. And it's something, you advise, I know, leaders and founders, and I work for two amazing women who founded Cambio, and their stories, if people heard the background of how and how hard it was to build this company in a very male dominated old white guy commercial real estate space, and how well we're doing. But they're too, and I try to encourage them that to be more active, to be on podcasts, to be more vocal on social media, but they're like, we're too busy building. But that's a challenge for them right now, because people do want to hear from them, and that's an opportunity. But yeah, it's just a long way of answering, I think, and I'm sure
Yeah.
you agree. As more and more slop gets out there, you can't just have press releases and random social media posts from your
No.
company account. Like, people want to hear from individuals, people.
Yeah, and I think people are really looking for transformation too. I think like during the pandemic, we had these kind of course booms, right? And then kind of this idea around like thought leadership. Everyone learned to code. Now it's like everyone learn AI because you're going to need it for, the workforce. And I think that I try to, especially on LinkedIn. I don't know that I'm as prolific as you are from a very opinionated perspective, but I try to speak to the differences in an old model of thinking for leaders versus those who are, true futurists, right? And more so thinking about like I don't think that you can be a leader during this time and not be hyper focused on the infrastructure of how we build and our competition on a global scale. Like I think that you can't be myopic, especially when other countries are like being flooded with opportunities for clean energy just by nature of the lack of infrastructure within their geographic regions, and sort of solar, wind, regenerative systems are the only things that can work and operate at scale. And so I think smart leaders who are going to take their companies or organizations to the next level, are a lot more grounded in I have to think differently. We have to think more sustainability. We've got to look 10, 20, 40 years out, and not just for the moment and the trend. And so that's what I try to speak to. Like, let's forget all the slop, right? Like, let's actually have the real conversation about whether or not you're an environmentalist or planeteer or whatever it is you call yourself, like, are you a futurist? And are you a futurist on the right side of history when it also looks like, depending on a finite resource like fossil fuels, is just not in our best interest, and that's just common freaking sense, right? And so yeah, I again, that for me is my resolve in terms of messaging, and really, forcing us to think about the bigger question at play. And granted, I have quite a few friends who are in executive roles. It's been a year and a half since they've been, hired, right? And they are like extremely qualified professionals. And it has been a challenge, in this market.
It's tough out there, for sure.
It's very
Yeah.
tough. It's very, very tough. And so, and it's hard and it's exhausting. And it's also the kind of perfect time to invent,
Look
you
at that.
know?
Look at that. Transition to optimism. And that's a good segue. So we're gonna wrap up here. And we usually ask our guests what you've experienced in a world where, and we've touched on a lot of this today, of negativity and too much focus on the downsides of our movements. We like to end on hope and optimism. So I'm going to ask that in a way, but also kind of frame it more towards your personal life as someone who I admire and follow. Like, you relocated to New York, you got big things happening. So finish us off here. What are you excited about for the future? What gives you hope? And then, yeah,
Yeah.
how's New York City treating you?
Oh my gosh, it's so good to be back. I've only been here as a student, so this is my first time back as like a semi-functioning adult, and kind of rebuilding my sense of self and network here. And what's been really beautiful is just being invited, into community, and an opportunity to connect with folks in various like fields, right? And just how amazing it is to see people who are builders, investors who are not loud, right? They're not super popular, but they're doing the work behind the scenes, and it's pretty substantial and it's pretty inspiring. So that
Fire,
kind of
yeah.
like lets me know I made the right move to come back here.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, I don't know how you know my whole background. I moved to New York 3 years ago. Spent most of my adult life on the West Coast, so it's been a little bit of shock to my networking life as well. And I will also say what's good and bad about that is New York's got people building, New York's got people fighting, New York's got people that aren't making excuses, and that's a good community to be around for sure. I'm sure you can.
Absolutely.
Well, Sherrell, it's been a pleasure. Let's wrap it up on that.
Thank you.
Always looking for plugs. Where do people find you? You're all over the place, I'm sure, but please direct people to the right
Yeah.
places.
Definitely LinkedIn, Sherrell Dorsey, and then Threads, Instagram, all those fun spots where I just yap, Sherrell_Dorsey. And then I have a Substack called Regenerative. So definitely look that up. I try at least once a month to push my thinking on the intersection of AI and climate and what the bigger question is. So definitely subscribe.
Good stuff. Well, we'll promote it all in the show notes, and I thank you again for joining us. And
Thanks for having me again, Joel.
if Owen wasn't such a good long-term friend, I would fire him in a minute to have you as my future co-host. But
Oh, I'm not trying to take your job, I promise.
well, cool. Well, thank you, Sherrell. Thank you, Owen, out there kicking butt, installing solar. Thank you to our audience for joining. You can find Owen and I on LinkedIn, usually actively antagonizing the more talk, more complaining sustainability crowd. You can find this podcast and more great content at lesstalkmoreaction.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to take action to make the world a better place?